Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond, from the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty. Our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
Hey everyone, it's Dr. Marinelli here. Today I'm joined by Dr. Flick, who's a master advisor with Med School Coach as well. And today we wanted to break down some of the secondary application questions that you may be working through. We've covered secondaries before on the podcast, but I thought it may be a good idea to get some other opinions and other approaches and really just have a discussion on how to tackle some of these secondaries. Dr. Flick, thanks for being on today.
Thanks, Dr. Marinelli.
So let's start with one of the most common secondary applications. Why do you want to go to this school? Dr. Flick, how do you suggest that people approach this one?
This is a good one, and it pretty much comes up on almost every secondary, and it's easy to kind of blow this one off and maybe just use a generic response that you're using for every school, like, I want to do this research or I want to do this volunteer program. But the best way to approach this question is to really spend a good amount of time hunting around on the school's website. Find some things that are truly unique to the school. Maybe if you're really into research, you could identify a particular program or project that's being worked on. Keep in mind that some things are just common to every school. So if you just mention a student-run clinic, that's not going to be enough. Every school has that. So try to find what's unique about the school, compare it to different websites, and go from there. And then take the extra step to identify how you connect to that. So if you're mentioning that you're interested in some student-run organization, just provide some background, some rationale for why you're interested in it.
I totally agree. And one caveat to your last point is I find a lot of applicants will kind of go into too much depth when they talk about their connection with something in particular. And it's okay, I think, to say in a sentence or two why you may be interested in a student-run clinic or something to that nature. Maybe you did something similar in undergrad, so maybe just a sentence or two. But you don't need to write a whole paragraph on that experience that's already elsewhere in your application. So instead, focus on what the school offers and then make that short connection to yourself. Would you agree with that approach?
Definitely agree, and especially keeping it short, because you don't want to list every single thing you're interested in at the school. That just becomes a list. So I think the golden number is 2. One example in a paragraph doesn't really show your interest, and 3 or more tends to come off as a list because you just don't have enough chance to expand upon it in a paragraph. So 2 seems to be like the sweet spot for identifying your interest.
Yeah, and one other thing I would say is, besides what Dr. Flick had mentioned about kind of scouring the website and finding some things that interest you, go down to the basics too. Like, it's okay to mention location of the school. Like, maybe that's probably one of the biggest draws to a lot of schools is the location. It's close to home, it's close to family. You want to be in New York City, whatever it may be. It's okay to mention that as kind of your overall arching reason for at least identifying that school, and then go into more specifics that maybe you found interesting as well. Let's move on to another question that I think probably almost every applicant I've ever worked with asked me about how to go about answering this question. Diversity. How can you contribute diversity to this school, or what diverse experiences will you contribute? There's tons of different ways of asking this question. How does somebody go about answering it, Dr. Flick?
I think the most straightforward way to approach it for somebody is the point of the question is they're looking for a different kind of people in their school. Now, the most obvious way to approach that is usually ethnicity, which can work for some people, but maybe not for others. So if you happen to be part of an underrepresented minority in medicine, say you're Latino or Latina, then you definitely want to play that up. I mean, schools are frankly just looking for that. So that certainly brings diversity to the class. But, for other people, you may not fall into one of those ethnicities, and that's okay. Think of different ways of being diverse, maybe diverse education. Maybe you went to a smaller school or a bigger school. Maybe you studied a major that some people isn't very common. Maybe you're non-science, or maybe something beyond just the typical pre-med or biology. Maybe it's how you grew up. Maybe it's a particular way you have of approaching problem solving. Maybe you've got some kind of background in sports or other kinds of extracurriculars. These can all be diverse things that you bring to the school that are beyond probably the number one thing that people jump to, like ethnicity.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's more about diverse experiences or diversity as a person. One thing I will throw in here too is this is just a tough question, I think, for most applicants to think, because in a way the question is what makes you unique? And most people have a hard time kind of doing that introspection and really deciding what is it that's unique about me. So I definitely encourage you to talk to your family, some of your friends, your peers, get help from advisors, help from med school coach, where someone can objectively look at you and the things that you've done and help kind of identify what it is that makes you unique and that really diverse experience about you. What about one of the simple questions that I get a ton of questions on are the schools asking you to list your activities. Again, what's up with those?
Yeah, I think these are really annoying, and you got to just understand that a lot of schools are hitting you with secondaries just to collect your money. So I don't know how they would really use this to compare with your AMCAS, especially it's usually a shorter character limit. Maybe it's kind of a go-to for them to just quickly reference how many of one activity they did. But really the bottom line is you got to do it. Just don't copy paste from AMCAS. You don't have to reinvent the wheel when you're writing them up. Just bullet point form is fine. Just kind of list them down the line.
Yeah, I agree. I struggle with identifying how schools will use this information. I think one rebuttal to you, Dr. Flick, is maybe it's not only secondaries are to collect money, but I think secondaries are another hoop for students to go through. Like, it's really easy to click a school to apply to on AMCAS. It only costs $35 or so, and that's it. Your application gets sent to them. But it takes a lot more effort and money to complete a secondary application. So only students that are actually willing to take that time, that effort, that expense will actually complete it. So it's kind of another way for schools, I think, to kind of screen down and narrow that applicant pool. So, this is maybe just a question that they use to further narrow it down, but also I think probably just to organize it in one manner, so it's kind of across the board. Each member of their admissions committee kind of has the same exact information and presentation of the information for each applicant.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and I think it's a good point to say don't underestimate the simple secondary too, because some people may put this one aside because they have longer ones to work on. Just get it done and send it in. But yeah, you're right. They are trying to screen out the people's interest in the school.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point there. Another one that is commonly thrown out that is the challenges. And the question that I get from so many applicants is, how do I answer this? I didn't really have any significant challenges from, growing up to this point in my life. And, for them, I say, congratulations, that's awesome. But really, Dr. Flick, what is it that medical schools are trying to get from this question? And how is it that applicants who maybe have never really faced some significant challenges, how should they go about answering it?
This one really sticks out in my mind because I remember being on the selection committee and basically nixing an applicant just based on this question alone. And I think it's important to remember what this question represents and how it portrays yourself. So if you write a challenge that ends up coming off as not so challenging, then the selections committee may look at that and just say, hey, this guy just doesn't have enough life experience. They haven't really been tried and tested. And if they think something as insignificant as, for example, this one that comes to mind was training their dog was challenging. If that was the hardest thing you've ever faced in your life, how are you going to be able to deal with life and death situations in medicine? So, you may not have something dramatic, some big challenge that you went through, but make sure you have somebody else read it and see how it comes off. Because sometimes it portrays you as sheltered or kind of growing up in a bubble if you don't have some kind of challenging experience. Everybody goes through something. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Just make sure it demonstrates some good quality in you, something that paints you in a good light.
Yeah, and what they're looking for specifically as far as paints you in a good light is how you responded from that challenge and what kind of positive growth that you've had out of it. I think this question definitely takes a lot of introspection for most people. Some people have obvious challenges like a death in the family or health issues, things like that. Whereas a lot of applicants just haven't really experienced something super dramatic or significant, like Dr. Flick mentioned. And this takes some time just to think about it. I think about challenges as far as growing up. Maybe your parents were divorced. Maybe you moved around a lot. Maybe there were financial struggles within your home. Maybe transitioning to college was really difficult for you initially and you struggled with your grades and meeting friends. Those are all significant challenges, and as Dr. Flick said, the way that you actually present it is what's important. The other thing I want to say here too, and Dr. Flick, let me know if you agree, is some people will talk about specific health issues or mental health issues here, which in my opinion, I think is fine. However, you have to be a little bit careful here. Number one, you don't want to give the impression to admissions committees that there's anything related to you personally that could be troublesome as a medical student, that could cause potential problems. And number two, you have to be willing to talk about this during an interview. So if you mention a health issue, don't be surprised if during an interview, the interviewer wants to know more about it and asks you further questions. So you kind of have to be ready to expand on it. So that's why I caution people to use some of their more personal experiences like health or mental health. How about that? Do you agree, Dr. Flick?
Yeah, I think that's fine. It just has to be done very carefully. So especially with mental health is that, as physicians, we understand that mental health is actually a big problem even in our own specialty with medical students, residents, attending physicians. So a lot of us, I hope that we are all very understanding of that, but you have to understand that you don't know who your reader is. So as much as I'd like to think most of us in medicine, and especially in academic medicine, are understanding of that, you just don't know who's going to read your essay, and they may not like that. So at the risk of offending even just one, reader, or not offending, but, painting yourself in a bad light or putting a bad taste in their mouth, I think it's best to avoid this if you can and use something else. So while it's not wrong, and I certainly understand that a lot of people go through those problems and it doesn't really contribute to your ability to be a successful medical student or physician, it just has to be done very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think on top of that, presenting it very carefully is making sure that you're really addressing how you grew from the situation. So it could be very detrimental to your application if you said, I suffered from depression and I was hospitalized last year for, a month, but now I'm doing a lot better. If you kind of just ended it not with complete closure and really showing how you've grown from it, how you've really managed, maybe you've reached out and helped other people with depression, things like that, then I think it can be worrisome to admissions committees. So make sure you really emphasize the positive growth that came out of that specific challenge.
Yeah, I agree. I think ultimately the bottom line here is that the challenge essay should be very carefully reviewed and should go through several drafts to make sure that it's coming off in the right way for certain.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about one last question here, which I think everybody struggles with. What about those optional questions of, do you have anything else to add to the admissions committee?
Yeah, I like to keep this one simple, and I kind of just play it like this. If that's the only question on the secondary, then definitely fill it in, because you just don't want to send in a blank secondary. If it's not, if it's one of two or three, just leave it blank. It's very rare that there's something that's come up between your primary application and submitting your secondary application. Most of your entire resume and everything that you should have wanted to say in your application, it really should be said by now. So don't worry about leaving this one blank. And really what I tell clients as well is that from the perspective of an admissions officer, you got to consider that by the time we're reading the secondary, I've already read your demographics, all of your coursework and transcripts, all of your work and activities, your personal statement, and all of your letters of recommendation. So if you can tell me what I need to know quickly in your secondary, it's to your advantage. I'm pretty tired of reading by that point. So if there's nothing new to add, don't just write something in there for the sake of it.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I agree in part. I mean, I think that there are some areas that of your application that you may not have addressed on your primary application. Like, for instance, maybe you didn't really talk about like an upward trend in your GPA and why you struggled initially during your primary application. Really, your opportunity to do so would be in a personal statement. Maybe you didn't put it in there. So if you wanted to address that, I think it's fine. Some little areas where there may be discrepancies, but also don't overthink it. You don't need to write like, oh, I got a C in this class because I was sick during the final. Like, you don't need to give them every single detail, but if there's overarching issues or discrepancies in your application, you can use this space to address it. The other question I get pretty often tagging on this is, if they haven't asked previously on the secondary, should I put in here, why do I want to go to this specific school? What do you think about that one, Dr. Flick?
I think that's fair. I just wouldn't make a huge essay out of it. Maybe just introduce it briefly. That's a good opportunity to show your interest in the school, as long as it's personalized, which goes to the other thing, and I'll flip this one back on you, is that a lot of applicants will ask, what if I recycle an essay from another secondary that's not on this one? So let's say they don't ask about diversity on this essay. Can I go put my diversity essay here? What do you think about that?
I say that's a no-go, because it's pretty obvious, I think, from admissions standpoint, that you're just recycling an essay. The only time I've actually seen that successfully done is maybe if somebody really, really tailors it to that school. So, for example, maybe they're talking about their diversity essay and they say, maybe it was how they had trouble transitioning to a big city, coming from a small town, growing up, and then they, conclude in that essay for this new school, this is why I feel I would do very good at NYU, is because I'm really used to being in a big city. I've already made this transition and I'm confident I can do it again. So unless you can specifically, very, very specifically apply it to that particular school, I would not reuse an essay for those optional ones. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. People ask that all the time, and it's so obvious when you just copy, paste, and put it in there. So unless you're writing it fresh, don't just go grab some other essay and throw it in there to fill up the space. It's really obvious.
Yeah. And one other point, too, just going back to that writing, why do you want to go to this school, and that optional one, I agree with you, Dr. Flick. I think it can be done, but keep it concise. If they say, here, you have 1,000 characters, you probably don't want to fill up the whole 1,000 characters. You probably just want to write like a quick paragraph about why you want to go to that school specifically and make it concise and to the point. Because, again, this is optional. They're putting it there for you to tell them something that can really make or break your application or make it very significant. Don't waste their time just filling in words. Make it something useful that's going to actually really help your application. Dr. Flick, before we wrap up, do you have any last thoughts on the secondary applications?
Maybe just one last thought, since you kind of brought it up in that last question, is character limits and word limits. Don't try to fill up the whole thing if you don't have to. Back to my other point of where the admissions officer is by the time they get to your secondary, try to be as concise as you can. If it gives you 2,000 characters for every essay, try not to fill it up unless you absolutely have to.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's some secondaries that ask you, what is your most meaningful research experience? And they give you something, the character account that maybe is equivalent to like 3 sentences. Well, in that case, you can write those 3 sentences. It's pretty hard to give reasoning for your most meaningful experience or something to that extent in just a few lines. So you can use that. But if they give you a whole page to write a response about your challenge, and maybe, you first write 2 paragraphs on that challenge, you don't need to sit and spend more time to expand it to even something longer. So hopefully that helps everybody out there while you're sitting down and trying to crank out those secondaries. We know that this is a tough time. We know that these can be super exhausting. So my biggest recommendation is just sit down and start doing them and try to turn them around as soon as possible. Any final tips or recommendations?
No, thanks. Just stay on them, stay organized, and try to flip them around as quick as possible.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and medschoolcoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.